A major storm visited Santa Barbara late in January 1969, and the 28th dawned to clearing skies. On the first flight of the day between Los Angeles and San Francisco, an oil company executive exchanged pleasantries with a fellow passenger in the window seat. Glancing down at the oil rigs dotting the Santa Barbara Channel, the passenger remarked that something looked strange at Union Oil's newly erected Platform A. Leaning over to look, the oil man paled visibly. "Oh, my God," he murmured. What he saw was the start of the Santa Barbara oil spill. In the next few weeks, Santa Barbara and the nation began an exploration of the delicate balance between energy, economics, and environmental integrity that continues to this day. The social, political, and technical ramifications of the 1969 spill can be used to build a case study in human-environment relations. This news film and slides were taken in the days after control was lost on Platform A's fifth production well. The thick, sulfurous Santa Barbara crude, pressurized by pockets of natural gas, escaped into the channel through long faults or cracks in the ocean floor. The platform was evacuated many times during the following weeks because of the presence of highly explosive gas and mist from the blowout.
Lieutenant Brown, as far as the oil slick itself, how much more oil do we have off the Santa Barbara coast right now that may be moving this way?
Our surveillance flight initially reports we have a slick that extends approximately a quarter of a mile offshore.
How big an area is it covering now, this slick? At one time you were estimating some 200 square miles. How big does it go now?
The size and area of the slick is difficult to determine at this time because it's become so patchy and thinned out, and the percent coverage is so minimal in most areas, it's almost impossible to estimate.
Estimates ranging up to 50,000 barrels of oil, or 2.3 million gallons, gushed into the ocean during the first week and a half of the disaster. Efforts to stop the flow resulted in diminishing the leak to about 100 barrels per day. But the crude eventually hit beaches as far apart as Pismo and Malibu. The subsequent cleanup involved 1,200 people working shoulder to shoulder, spreading out 2,500 bales of straw a day to sop up the oil. The irony of rectifying a mistake of high technology with as primitive a substance as dried grass was not lost on the Santa Barbara community.
How bad is it, Mr. Sathry, as far as facilities at the harbor here and the yachts that are tied up and the other watercraft?
Well, every one of them have been affected. They've all got oil on them. They all need to be cleaned, and there's possibly some paint damage. All of our marinas, the facilities themselves are coated with this thick, oozy oil, and it's going to take a long time to clean this mess up.
Do you think the harbor will ever get back to its original state?
Oh, I'm sure that it will be cleaned up eventually. Of course, they've got to stop that oil flow out there at the wells before there's much that can be done here.
The impact of the spill on seals and birds was obvious. Thousands of grebes, loons, and cormorants became coated with the sticky crude and died. Less obvious to the lay observer was the impact of the oil on the fragile ecosystem of the intertidal zone and on the floor of the ocean.
A sweeping congressional investigation of the unholy, unhealthy, undemocratic alliance between the Department of the Interior and the petroleum industry was called for last week by a leader of opposition to oil drilling in the Santa Barbara Channel. Alvin C. Weingan, former state senator and a founder of the citizen group Get Oil Out, or GOO, told the Los Angeles audience this alliance is so close and of such long standing that you can't tell where the dog leaves off and the tail begins. It is a monster that, far from serving its master, the public interest has gone mad and bites the hand that feeds it, he said. Senator, those are strong words.
Indeed they are, and they were intended to be strong, Bill. I believe I'm speaking for the majority of people in Santa Barbara, if not Southern California, and a vast horde of Americans throughout the country when I make that statement. I do not believe that the Department of Interior has in any respect shown consideration for the people's interest of this area. They have constantly denied any recommendations, any suggestions, or any of the warnings that have been given. I can only conclude that there is a conflict of interest between the department and the petroleum industry, and this is what led me to make that statement.
Has this battle of the platforms in the channel become an anti-establishment type fight?
Well, to some extent, I suppose it has. A number of people are saying that in spite of the well-established, well-entrenched special interests, that there are higher values in drilling for oil out here and bringing a few dollars into the federal government, that our beaches are being despoiled, beaches cannot be replaced, and as a consequence, I suppose it has become an anti-establishment battle. I personally think that's the kind of anti-establishment battle we ought all to be interested in. That's much healthier than many of the things that are going on in our campuses, because the proper fulcrum is the state government and the federal government and their unresponsiveness, or rather their too ready responsiveness to the almighty dollar.
Well, not too much has happened. Can we look forward to some sort of action in the way of, say, the elimination of the platforms, the stoppage of the leak?
Well, you might better ask Governor Reagan that when he comes down here to speak to $100 a plate cocktail party later on this week.
Senator, do you feel Governor Reagan has adopted a go-slow policy with regard to oil legislation?
Well, again, I think we have to differentiate between the state and federal matters. He does feel that the procedures used by the federal government were very inadequate. And as long ago as 2 years, he had asked the federal government to turn over to the state inspection and regulation of offshore drilling. And as it turns out, prophetically, perhaps this would have prevented what occurred, because the state regulations apparently are much more stringent than the federal, and had they been followed in that there's an additional casing requirement, perhaps this tragedy would not have occurred. But I think insofar as calling for a halt, a permanent halt to drilling in the state tidelands, he's waiting for a review by the State Lands Commission and so forth before making a final determination.
One year later, on January 28, 1970, Santa Barbara captured the nation's attention once again, as the community found strength in its environmental solidarity and presented the Santa Barbara Bill of Environmental Rights at the first January 28th conference. At the University of California, Santa Barbara, faculty concerned about the spill planned a new academic program. Environmental studies began in the fall of 1970, with 3 courses, no paid faculty, and a secretary at 1/4 time. Now anticipating its 15th anniversary, the program includes 35 courses, 20 faculty, 5 full-time staff, and more than 300 majors. The purpose of the program is to understand and improve the long-term human relationship with the environment. The 1984 edition of the January 28th conference occurred on the eve of major expansions of offshore oil drilling and onshore oil and gas processing in the Santa Barbara area. Its focus was the give and take between energy economics and the environment. The day-long gathering, overlooking the channel and its oil fields, featured panels on oil, energy, and ethics.
How will oil development proceed in the Santa Barbara Channel so that 15 years from now we will still have been able to retain some of the importance of our environmental quality, both for us here. We will be able to set a model for oil and gas development statewide and nationally, and we will be able, in fact, to move from a petroleum-based economy into the inevitability of alternative energy sources in the future in a way that leaves us with a healthy environment for those that come after. We've also come to realize that there are various economies that interface with the oil economy, and many of them conflict in our local scene and need to be accommodated and need to be part of the dialogue. On our panel here, we have represented some of those other economic interests.
Doug Knapp, representing the commercial fishermen of Santa Barbara, mentioned four main concerns of the local fishing industry and the efforts underway to negotiate their resolution with oil production. Those key issues are the destruction of fishing gear by oil ships and structures, ocean right-of-way and space conflicts, the effects of sonic disturbances on fish populations during oil exploration activities, and finally the biological effects of dumping drilling muds and cuttings into the ocean.
Another thing that the fishing industry had a concern about is the dumping of drill muds, which it's an issue which is so up in the air. I remember at the Coast Commission hearing, the Coast Commission staff said, well, we have a room full of information on this, stacks of literature, but it's divided 50-50 pro and con. So I believe this time they're still dumping drill muds out there in the channel, and they're considered too toxic to be dropped into a normal disposal area. It has to go to a toxic waste site on shore, so we find that's a little disconcerting that this issue really hasn't been solved to our satisfaction. It's still going on, it's an ongoing practice, and we feel that it's just contributing to the degradation of the water quality. The ocean waters represent the 100% environment of all those creatures out there, and their success in their life cycle is very dependent on the quality of the water. There's studies done on the East Coast that show that the health of the populations is directly related to the levels of pollution.
I wanted to just point out that our nation produces or requires somewhere a little over 12 million barrels of oil a day. We produce in our nation a little over 8 million barrels of oil a day, and the balance is imported oil from foreign sources, Mexico, the Near East, and so on. And I read in the LA Times today about the increasing imbalance of trade that our nation's facing, and I just quickly figured out that, and the LA Times referred to this, that there was some $50 billion a year being paid for imported oil, which amounts to a substantial impact to our national balance of trade. The environmental awareness of this Santa Barbara oil spill, and it was a tragic event, don't misunderstand me, but it did generate one of the strongest peacetime movements in our country's history, certainly to protect the environment and make our living on this earth of ours environmentally safe, and we are all concerned with it. We all need to be aware of our natural resources and yet improve our environmental standard of living. Let's take a quick look at environmental laws, and it was touched on briefly, but prior to 1969 there were only a very handful of environmental laws. I just want to mention that the Submerged Lands Act of 1953, Fish and Wildlife Act, the Bald Eagle Protection Act, and a very few of them. However, since the oil spill and in the last 15 years, there have been over 30 major environmental laws have been passed to help us protect our environment. In 1969, the offshore production from our channel was, both state and federal waters, was about 60,000 barrels a day. Today, in 1985, we have increased that 60,000 from the channel to 187,000 barrels a day of oil. You all know that our future estimates from the Santa Maria Basin and channel amount to nearly 500,000 barrels a day, and that should be arriving by the 1990s. The impact on the state's production and the federal government's production is very noticeable. By then, we estimate that we will produce more than 50% of the state's production from the Santa Barbara, Santa Maria Channel area. The platform count, I have that too, and in 69 there were 12 platforms. Now I believe we have 19 covering the same water. But the key to it is communication and getting together and working out the problem before it becomes an insurmountable, head-knocking lawsuit and emotional affair. The fishermen and the oil industry have worked together and improved our relations immeasurably.
I'm going to, I think, refine my comments to being a member of the Natural Resources Committee in the State Assembly and also as one of the legislative representatives to the Coastal Conservancy as well. I continually ask my question, do we really need to worry about our environment here in the offshore development? And I think clearly 100 times I ask myself that question, I get the same answer 100 times, and the answer is yes, we do need to worry. Do we need to worry about what's going on in the California State Legislature? And the answer, again, very definitely is yes. It's very hard to get good bills passed right now in the climate in Sacramento. I think that our strategy, at least to some extent, has to be to protect what we already have, some of the gains that we've made over the last several years, really seek to protect the status quo. You've heard both Jack and Doug mention the impacts of the drilling muds, and there's been legislation introduced on drilling muds, but again, really lacks support in the state legislature. You're familiar with the State Lands Commission. We currently have 3 members on the State Lands Commission. I introduced a bill to try to expand that membership to more accurately reflect, I think, the needs of people along the coast and the citizens of this state. Of the 3 members, 2 have an economic perspective. We have the controller, dollars and cents. We have the finance guy who has $2 for eyeballs, and we have the lieutenant governor. And unfortunately, all of the votes on the State Lands Commission are 2-1. And so, I've been around long enough. When you can't win by the current rules of the game, you change the rules of the game. And so CEQA, it's constantly under attack in Sacramento. The Coastal Act, of course, you're familiar with the Williamson Act on land, and there are constantly holes and windows being poked in the Williamson Act. The Timber Protection Zone, always under attack. And so, yes, we do need to worry. We don't just have to worry about what's going on in the state legislature and the legislative branch of government here in California, but also the executive branch as well. And yes, we have to worry about the governor. As mentioned earlier, he vetoed Ken Mattey's bill, which would have provided much-needed revenue for cities and counties to try to minimize the impact of oil. He vetoed a couple of other environmental bills, one creating an additional wilderness area, and a bill that was very important to the Coastal Conservancy, vetoed that bill as well. You're familiar with the budget cuts in his last year's budget, practically emasculated the Coastal Commission and the Energy Commission as well. And when I had a meeting with him in his office, and I tried to express to him my concerns on the rapid development of offshore oil in the Santa Barbara Channel, he assures me that it's 99% safe. And when I invite him to come down here and make those assurances, he hasn't come down yet.
Most people, I think of the spills themselves as the most damaging thing. And they forget that there are all kinds of land use problems that are associated with development of offshore oil. The pipelines have to come on shore somewhere. The oil has to be refined somewhere, and those all cause problems, particularly not only with land use but with air quality, because both the onshore and offshore facilities do create those problems, and I can attest to that personally because in Kern County in the Bakersfield area we have a lot of refineries, a lot of oil production, and air quality is a very severe problem in that closed basin. In fact, the Secretary of the Air Resources Board, Gordon Duffy, was mentioned sometime, I think just a few days ago, that the agriculture in the Central Valley loses hundreds of millions of dollars every year due to poor air quality. And a large part of that, particularly in Kern County, comes from the activities of the oil industry. Then another problem that, again, you're probably thinking of more than I am, the shipping of the crude oil up and down the coast, both from foreign sources and from Alaska. I wonder, as the platforms proliferate out in the channel, how those oil tankers are going to continue to be able to negotiate that maze of platforms out there, particularly in fog and bad weather. I would think that'd be a very serious problem that should be given a lot of concern and planning. If you stop to think about it, the environmental movement's really been alive and growing in the United States for over 100 years. I don't know when you can say it began, but certainly one of the early people who began to awaken the American conscience to our environment was Thoreau, way back before the Civil War. After the Civil War, Yellowstone National Park was created. And more national parks were created in the last part of the 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt, a good Republican, by the way, was one of the best environmental presidents we've had this century and did a lot to set aside our public lands. Environmental awareness was growing through the 20s and the 30s. Aldo Leopold wrote Sand County Almanac in the late 1930s. After the interruption of World War II, laws began to be passed in Washington. One of the landmark laws that I can remember is the Wilderness Act of 1964, and then many other laws followed that we've mentioned here, laws that protected our environment like NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, Air Quality Act, you can go on and on. Those laws were passed not because the Sierra Club or some other environmental organization, as rich extremists out there, were lobbying Congress. They were passed because Congress knew that the public wanted those things, and it wasn't just a few extremists asking for them. And then if you look ahead, if any of you have read the Global 2000 report that President Carter had commissioned at the end of his term as president, it predicted what some of the problems would be in the future, in the year 2000, if we continue with our current trends. The world's population would be up to 6.28 billion people. I can't remember all the numbers, but something like 15 or 20% of the species of plants and animals that live in the world today would be extinct by that time. And that an area the size of the state of Maine was going out of agricultural production worldwide every year. An area half the size of California is being deforested worldwide every year. And those are things that can't go on forever without having to pay a really serious price.
There are some lessons to be learned from the Santa Barbara blowout 15 years later. I think some of those lessons were learned then, some of those lessons we're still learning today. The first lesson that was learned in 1969 was that the development of oil and gas on the outer continental shelf is not a benign technology. There is still oil leaking from the seafloor near Platform A today. There are scientists who feel that the biological impacts in the Santa Barbara Channel can still be detected and measured. There are long-term effects from the release of oil into the marine environment. The dead birds have gone away, but there are still impacts. But each of you needs to realize that this is your future, this is your coastline, these are your decisions, and I hope that you will take them seriously. Thank you.
I have just a statistical question for Mr. Hundley. You mentioned we had 12 platforms in 1969, 19 in 1984, and the production will be triple that in 1990, but you left out how many platforms will there be? How many can we expect?
I wish I could answer that question for you. The number of platforms depends solely on the number of discoveries that are made. At the present time, the giant Hueso field off of Point Conception, there are 3 platforms scheduled for that, 3 additional platforms. Union Oil has an additional platform on the drawing boards, and in the permitting stages, we also have platform on our Cola Point.
Given the rigs that you're mentioning might possibly occur, and then also with Exxon's project calling for another 4 right off of Gaviota and Tahigas, right off the bat, you're looking at 9 or 10 right there, not including anything that's going to happen further offshore. I can see that the number of rigs are going to double anyway in the next 10 years, easily, if not more, if these projects go ahead as planned.
All of you are familiar with the California gold rush of 1849. What I'm afraid you're going to see is the California oil rush of 1984.
First of all, since '79, the country has 100 times as much new energy from savings as from all net expansions of energy supply put together. Those millions of individual actions in the marketplace, many of you, no doubt, weatherizing your homes, getting more efficient cars, plugging steam leaks, whatever it is you did, have together provided more than 100 times as many additional BTUs net as all of the new oil and gas wells, coal mines, and power plants built in the same period. Moreover, since '79, we've had more new energy from sun, wind, water, and wood, the renewable sources, than we've had from oil, gas, coal, and uranium, or any of them. So that these sources, which we were told couldn't do much until at least the next century, and maybe not even then, are now 8% of our total primary energy supply and the fastest growing part. We're approaching now our millionth solar building, most of them passive, most of those made by fixing up existing buildings with greenhouses and the like. We've ordered, since '79, more new electric generating capacity from small hydro and wind power than from coal or nuclear plants or both, without even counting their cancellations. You know, there hasn't been a single big power plant ordered in this country since late '81 for very good economic reasons. Wood, which doesn't even show in the government energy statistics, is now delivering twice as much energy as nuclear power, which had a head start of 30 years and about $40 billion in direct federal subsidies. Wood came on in about 5 years with no subsidies. In other words, we're finding it is, in practice, not just in theory, a lot faster to do millions of small, simple things that are accessible to everybody than to build a few big multi-billion-dollar projects that are complex and take 10 years. And yet, even this remarkable progress, where, for example, we've already reduced in 10 years by a quarter the amount of energy it takes to make $1 of GNP, that remarkable progress barely scratches the surface of what is available and worth buying. There are, for example, cost-effective technologies now on the market which can roughly double the practical efficiency of industrial motors. That one saving would more than replace every reactor in the country, which can double the efficiency of jet aircraft, triple that of steel mills, quadruple that of household appliances or light bulbs, quintuple that of cars. If you're thinking about saving oil, you might like to know that even 3 years ago, Volkswagen had already tested an advanced diesel Rabbit that does 80 miles a gallon city and 100 highway without nearly pulling out all the stops that are technically available and worth doing. The best new buildings now require essentially no space conditioning energy. We even have technologies for fixing up many existing buildings nearly to that standard in a way that still saves money. So there's been an incredible technological revolution going on, and it is continuing. If anything, it's accelerating. Probably half the important energy-saving measures known today didn't even exist 2 years ago. And the consequence of adding up these kinds of available savings throughout a modern industrial economy is that even if you want to assume complete Los Angelesization of the planet with 5 cars and a boat and a helicopter in every garage, it's still very hard to figure out how we're going to need more energy in the future than we have needed now or recently. We now know that basic weatherization in this decade can save 5 Santa Barbara channels worth of oil capacity. It is some 2.5 million barrels a day. In the next decade, it can do the same all over again, another 2.5 million barrels a day. There's 10 Santa Barbara channels worth lurking in the stock of gas guzzlers, which could be scrapped and converted into efficient cars. That is, rather than investing in Arctic or indeed a lot of offshore oil and gas or in synthetic fuels, it would be cheaper to give you a free 40-plus mile a gallon car, provided you would scrap your Brontomobile and get it forever off the road so nobody will ever drive it again. or it would be worth paying you several $100s for every mile per gallon by which your new car improves on your old car which you scrap. In fact, even if Detroit spent 5 or 10 times what it would actually cost, if Detroit spent, say, $100 billion retooling to make promptly a 60-mile-a-gallon fleet, instead of waiting 30 years to get there through umpteen generations of cars with very small improvements along the way. Even with that gigantic, implausible investment, if we spread it over the next new fleet of cars and light trucks, each one would cost almost $800 more on the sticker price. But you'd get that back at the present gasoline price in about 16 months. It really makes you wish we had an economically conservative administration. Now, another way of putting this is that just the two biggest oil-saving measures, stop living in sieves and stop driving Petropigs, could together more than eliminate all U.S. oil imports in this decade before a power plant or a synthetic fuel plant ordered now could deliver any energy whenever and at a tenth of its cost. And in case there are any wildcatters out there, let me put it in still a different way. I happen to know where in the United States there is a supergiant oil field fully equivalent to the biggest oil field in Saudi Arabia. This domestic all-American oil can be not just extracted but sustainably produced at more than 5 million barrels a day, and it'll cost only a few bucks a barrel. Anyone interested? The oil's under Detroit. I've just given you the economic equivalent of scrapping the gas guzzlers and substituting more efficient cars, which we already know how to make. Now, if you were Union Oil or Exxon, why would you want to go to awkward, environmentally sensitive places to drill for very expensive oil that might not even be there when you know there's all that cheap oil under Detroit? Or if you did go to the ends of the earth to find more expensive oil and somebody else found all that cheap oil under Detroit, wouldn't you feel sort of silly? That's the kind of competition we're seeing as a competitive market emerges for energy services. That is, you don't want oil, you want mobility, or comfort, or shaft power, or light. You want the tasks done that energy does for you. And you can choose whether to do those tasks by buying more fuels, by buying electricity, by buying renewable technologies, or by buying efficiency. Oil then does not just have to compete with gas or uranium, it has to compete with weather stripping, a very tough competitor.
Back in 1977, I introduced a solar tax credit bill, and when I introduced it at the request of people in Isla Vista primarily, and really the credit for this legislation goes to some people in the Isla Vista community associated with Sunray who brought this to my attention, who did an outstanding job of lobbying on behalf of the bill. In addition, Governor Jerry Brown, who is a favorite whipping boy for a lot of people in Sacramento today, if it were not for his leadership, enlightened leadership on this issue, we would have not had the leadership role in solar energy, I believe, that California has today. Once this legislation was enacted in our state, both the federal government and other states came to us to try and develop a similar kind of program. And as a result of what we did here in California, well over a majority of the states in the country now have tax credit provisions similar to ours. And in fact, when we were working, and I want to speak to this a little bit later, on the renewal of the solar tax credit legislation last year, one of the arguments that we were able to use is that if we did not renew this tax credit and if we did not maintain it, that we were going to be losing solar industries to other states that had as generous and in some instances perhaps more generous tax credits than we had in California. They had taken our model and had gone one better. Also, our legislation became a model for an energy conservation tax credit that was enacted in, I believe, 1979 or 1980. And as Amory made reference to the energy conservation savings, that has been reinforced by our energy tax credit legislation in California that was based upon the solar tax credit legislation.
We've been told for years that none of these technologies will really do it. Solar isn't that big. It's not going to make that big a difference. Wind is nice, but you don't have wind every place. There's only a few places that have really good wind resources. Geothermal is probably excellent, but how many places can you actually develop geothermal? Cogeneration is very fine, but you only have a limited number of cogeneration opportunities. Biomass fuels are excellent, but again, they're limited and you've only got certain biomass fuels available in certain locations. But as Amory had so well pointed out in his original articles on this topic and has continued to say, when you add them all up, you have a significant amount. You can make a big difference. At the present time, we have almost 800 megawatts of renewable energy developed by the private sector online and generating in this state. Now, this state has a peak demand, so that you have something to compare that to, of about 38,000 megawatts peak demand. So that's about 2% of the electricity being generated in California is coming from privately produced energy from renewables and cogeneration. But in addition to that, we have 5,600 megawatts that are in some phase of final contract negotiation with California utilities, according to the California utilities' own records. That's approximately 14% of the generating capacity of this state coming from renewables being developed by the private sector. Now, if you add into that the renewable energy technologies that are online and or coming online that the utilities are financing themselves, I believe we are in excess of 20% of California's electricity generation, either coming now from renewables or in the very near future. We absolutely need your support. We need support of the ratepayers and the taxpayers. If you don't want more nuclear power plants, if you don't want coal plants in California, if you don't want a lot more drilling platforms, you have to be for something. And you have to have a viable alternative, and you need to support that alternative with as much enthusiasm as you may oppose some of the other things that you really didn't want in place. We need to have you supporting the alternatives that we feel are a better alternative to the ones that we've turned down. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. Those alternatives are not going to be without blemishes. They are going to have warts here and there, and they are going to have problems in getting them in place. But if they're preferable to these other options that you have said you don't want, then we need your support to help get them there and to help make them work.
What we're looking at is not just your bill, it's the whole allocation of capital in our society. And that goes to the point that the first speaker mentioned. I worked out recently that it can easily cost a nuclear utility more capital investment to build the system to run your electric baseboard heaters than it costs the contractor to build the entire house which contains those heaters. So that off-site utility investment costing more than the house is, of course, the competitor for the builder's next loan to build the house. Part of the reason we're seeing high interest rates is that we're still pouring of the order of $20 or $30 billion a year nationally down the rat hole of building power plants that we won't need and won't be able to pay for. Just a couple of years ago, we were spending 3 times as much money building reactors that, for the most part, will never be finished, economically should never be finished, than we were investing in the entire automobile industry. If we get serious about using energy in a way that saves money, there will be a national net saving over the next couple of decades of several trillion of today's dollars, and about 1 million jobs to go with it, just from doing the cheapest things first. And no matter what your social goals are, I don't understand how we're going to achieve very many of them without having the financial flexibility that comes from a saving of that magnitude.
But let me put this in perspective for just a moment. It's my standard perspective. What do we have? What are we doing to it? From Cousteau, the simple example, if the earth was the size of an egg, all the water would be but a drop in the eggshell. It doesn't sound believable, but it's true. The drop would be about 1/6 of an inch across. The atmosphere liquefied, for comparison, would be about 1/30 of an inch across. The soil that Wes Jackson is expert on would be a speck barely visible to the naked eye. Those are the differences between us and anything else we know of in the universe, and we're steadily speeding to just destroy that difference. To find out how fast you squeeze the Earth's age to the week of creation, 6 days. Creation starts Sunday midnight, life Tuesday noon. By all kinds of diversity comes from there. By Saturday morning, there's been enough diversity and enough chlorophyll at about 6 o'clock that the oil and fossil fuels can start to form. At 4 in the afternoon, the great reptiles are on stage. At 9 o'clock, they're off. At 10 o'clock, the great whales go back to sea. Something like 5 minutes before midnight, something like us. But 11 seconds before midnight, we're still Neanderthal. And indeed, not until about 1 3/4 seconds before midnight do we invent agriculture. And we're so efficient with that within about the next half second, the forests that had ringed the Mediterranean were reduced to pitiful fragments, such as the cedars of Lebanon. 1/3 of a second, Buddha. 1/4 of a second, Christ. 1/40th of a second, the Industrial Revolution. 1/80th of a second, the discovery of oil. And the discovery of science, to which we pay a great deal more attention while we pay a great deal less attention to the teachings of Christ. 1/500th of a second before midnight, the sudden addiction to exponential growth in our attack on renewable resources. And now midnight, and what are we going to do when most national leaders, most universities, consider that kind of growth perfectly acceptable, when anybody who looks at it long enough knows it cannot possibly be. The quick one-liner there is that that 500th of a second amounts to the close of World War II. The Soviet Union started the gross national product race. The United States did not want anyone to have a grosser national product, entered the race, Japan won it. And what do we do for an encore? And that, because this pressure on the earth, our war against the earth, has now brought us our reward, and it is indeed a scary one. It's the one that was underlined in the recent conference on the long-range biological effects of nuclear war, the imminence of a nuclear winter, where even if we fired at the Soviets because they're so bad and an evil empire, a small part of our nuclear arsenal, and wiped them out, within 2 weeks we would be wiped out by the nuclear winter itself. We are now down to a 7-minute warning. It is now at this time, whatever your watch says, mine says 3:34. By 3:41, the world as you know it could be obliterated. Our science and our carelessness and our addiction to growth and our mistreatment of the earth has brought us this reward. That 7 minutes used to be about 30 minutes, but Mr. Reagan has cut it to 7 by moving missiles over to Europe that make it that short a distance between those missiles and the Soviets are moving their submarines closer so that we've got 7 minutes. And we've got to change that. And I think the big pressure has come from this strange addiction to growth, the idea that we have to have more and more people, that we do not understand that we're part of the web of life, not all of it, that we are Johnny-come-latelys, terribly recent. Life here for 3.5 billion years, our sophisticated life here for a few thousand. And we think we know it all, that everything is here to serve us. One of the things I've urged is that we go back to the mountain and go up to see what happened to the tablets Moses forgot to bring down. He brought down 2 that gave us 10 commandments. But those 10 commandments say nothing about how we should treat the earth. And Ray Asman has raised that question, and I raise it, and we must all raise it. We're treating it as if there were spare, and there isn't. And if there's going to be a space colony, I can think of people I would like to send up there and keep there. But none of you. So somehow we have to address the question of growth, and nobody wants to, or hardly anybody wants to. It's uncomfortable. If you oppose it, you're anti-growth and they don't want to listen to you, and off go the hearing aids, or the television channel is switched. Developers don't want you to question growth. The oil industry does not want you to question growth. So the population now is 4.7 billion. And the demographers tell you with no remorse that it's going to be 6 billion or more by the year 2000. And speaker after speaker says the population will be 6 billion by then. And I say that's nonsense. And it has to be nonsense because I don't think if we keep going up, over-jamming the earth with us at the expense of everything else, I don't think we're going to make the year 2000. We've already built too much tension around the world with what we've done already. Somebody mentioned fool's paradise. And I'd say that's about the standard of living we've been seeking and reveling in. our fool's paradise that Ronald Reagan celebrated in the State of the Union speech, where he said the United States is standing tall. The United States is not quite standing tall, it's doing something else. It's the 5% of the world's population using a third of the world's resources, thinking that that may not be enough, wanting more, not realizing that 95% of the world's population is liking the United States less and less. Some of the nations thinking they cannot afford the United States anymore. And you see tensions building. You see armament building. You see this enormous contribution. It's just about to be $1 trillion a year worldwide on defense. And if you start making the linkages, you begin to see where this came from. And it came in no small part from this nation's desire to be so dominant that it wanted to use that much of everybody else's resources for its standard of living, for its fool's paradise, and expects the rest of the world to like it. And the rest of the world does not like it, and it cannot be expected to like it. And if we think we're getting any security by building more and more super weapons and encouraging the other power to do the same thing, we're fooling ourselves. Richard Barnett puts it very succinctly: we do not increase our security by decreasing the security of our opponent. He has another one I like: we march toward annihilation under the banner of realism. We have some major changes in thinking to do. If we have any ethical obligation worth mentioning, it is this. It is to the hundreds of billions of people who have not yet been born, who deserve a chance to be, not too many at a time, who deserve a world as beautiful as ours, possibly more beautiful. And the ethics are this: the genes of those people are right here now in our custody. They're nowhere else. Nobody else can vote for them, and the oil companies are not voting for them. The ethics, we can build them up. One of the nice things to see is that there are a few radical doctors, now about 13,000 of them, who made up physicians for social responsibility. They've been followed by educators for social responsibility, planners and architects for social responsibility. Maybe we can try corporate executives for social responsibility. But more important, maybe we can try citizens for social responsibility.
A question that I'm asking these days as I go to and fro on my environmental errands, mostly as a way of trying to break out of some of our conventional thinking, our caveman mentality on how to get along. The question is this. I put it to lots of people, and it's a bothersome question. How long, under a Hitler type or a Stalin type, or the worst political absurdity that you can think of, would we have to live before it would compare to life in a nuclear wasteland? 5,000 years? 10,000 years? 20,000 years? Probably more. Now, if we really believe in the power of the human to change things, we, of course, realize that we would not stand for it that long. The question is, would we choose to not stand for it by using the caveman techniques?
Aldo Leopold, in his Sand County Almanac, called for an extension of ethics from man to the land. He asked that we change from ethics concerned solely with the human community to a more realistic land ethic, which, and I quote, simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, animals, or collectively the land. Now, when Leopold was writing in the late 30s, early 40s, the term ecosystem was not being widely used. And I think, however, that although Leopold would agree that what we need today is not just land, but ecosystem ethics. The distinction is not just playing with words, it's not just semantic. The concept of land takes in, for most of us at least, what's visible or otherwise apparent to the senses. But the concept of ecosystem focuses on processes, the dynamics of maintenance and change, of succession and retrogression. It's easy to love an animal or a wildflower, something you can see and experience. It takes a lot more empathy to develop a meaningful relationship with the biogeochemical cycle. Trees now are considered to have standing, but does a healthy nitrogen cycle have legal rights? Sustainability depends on people who see some continuity with the past and with the future. They're people who feel connections with their ancestors and with their grandchildren's grandchildren. They have, therefore, a sense of stewardship over the lands where they live and the resources they use. They're people who have developed an attachment to the place where they live. Some are natives of the land, but others have adopted a place like Santa Barbara and have found a home there. By contrast, sustainability has only some theoretical appeal to the mobile transients who feel their lives bounded by birth and death and whose connection with the land is that of temporary residents or visitors, transients on their way through. It's not my responsibility. I don't live here. They make a living from the land, but they don't live on the land. Now, I see little hope of changing the ethics of America if you take the whole big scene. I see great hope for developing ethics in place by people who live there, who feel for the land. It's been obvious listening to all of you today that Santa Barbarans can take care of Santa Barbara. You can develop your ethics here in place toward Santa Barbara. We'll worry about Santa Cruz up north. We may come down and give you a little advice now and then. But it's the first duty of all of us to come home, to find a place worth living for, and that's where I think ethics begins.
I think we need some large vision which is positive that we can work toward. And recently with some friends I was thinking maybe we should start something called Celebration 2000, a kind of Olympic game type celebration that we got to the year 2000. And that somehow to celebrate that that we've sustained our future to that point, and we've avoided nuclear holocaust and genocide, but some way in which we can work together toward that socially and culturally in ways that haven't been discovered yet. So we also are identifying new leadership, and the new leadership is right here. You first have to convince your neighbor. So please, I mean, you're all convinced, but your real neighbors where you live may not be, except in Santa Barbara. So please convince your neighbors. Thank you.
It seems to me that the sort of environmentalism that we've been talking about is mandated by justice. And if we ignore this mandate, injustice, then it seems to me that we ignore the very foundation of the rights and freedoms that we've fought for in this country for 200 years. We're just a little bit mixed up about what Americanism means. Most Americans, I think, don't see environmentalism as mandated by justice because we're really blind to the latest form of discrimination. The latest form of discrimination is environmental. The newest minority is geographical. I think what we have to do is to push a concept of amenity rights in our legislatures and perhaps even have a constitutional amendment. We have to make certain that we recognize that justice mandates a new class of rights that I'll call amenity rights. Those are rights to environmental well-being, rights to a livable environment. And that if we don't have those classes of amenity rights, we're being irrational and inconsistent. Why do I say that? We say it's wrong to kill, but we allow pollution, which is cumulatively responsible for 25% of our deaths, deaths that could be prevented simply by more responsible environmental actions. That's inconsistent to say that we can't kill, but we can pollute. It's irrational and inconsistent to say that we all have rights to equal protection, to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but to say that we don't have amenity rights to things like clean air and clean water and clean beaches, because all those things are necessary conditions for exercising our basic human rights.
It comes right back to you and what you think you're good at and making a commitment. And one of my old mountaineer friends, Bill Murray, put it this way: once you commit yourself, then providence moves too, and all sorts of things happen that would never otherwise have come your way. And hesitation passes beyond that. And he quotes Goethe, "Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has power, genius, and magic in it. So have at it yourself and then join with others in it. You'll change things."